Hello, and welcome to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are in the parasha of Balak. Now, towards the end of Balak, actually, before we get to the end of it, this Torah portion is perhaps most famously known for the talking donkey episode involving Bilam. However, we can definitely talk about that at another time. But what I do want to talk about is plagues, because at the end of this week's Torah portion, we have a plague that happens, or I should say it sort of pop-ups, it pops up, it occurs. And I realized we don't often talk about plagues in the Torah. I know that I haven't talked about them. So I wanted to briefly explore with you plagues in the Torah. Of the times that we see the term plague, magifa, in the Torah, most of these occurrences are in the book of Numbers. There is one time that it occurs in the book of Genesis, but most of them are in this book. Now, Book of Numbers, I mentioned here in Village Torah before that there are a lot of leadership challenges to Moses, and it's not unsurprising that these magefot, these plagues that happen, also present challenges to Moses's leadership. Now, the first time that we see the term magifa, plague, in the book of Numbers is the following. It's in chapter 14, where we see, as for the leaders whom Moses sent to scout the land, those who came back and caused the whole community to mutter against him by spreading calumnies about the land, those who spread such calumnies about the land died of plague by the will of the Lord. Of those involved in going to scout the land, only Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Yefuneh, survived. So this plague had 10 people, unless maybe this plague spread to others in the camp, or maybe others associated with these 10 leaders, but presumably this plague only spread to 10. There's not much more about the plague that befell these leaders, although the rabbis, as we'll get to a little bit later, have plenty to say. Now, the next time we see a plague is in just a few chapters later. This is on the heels of the, so let's just go back. So what we had just talked about, these leaders that had gone to scout the land, which we have discussed, they came back with a report, and 10 of these leaders said, you know what, maybe this just is not our time to go up. This is a pretty scary land. Whereas Caleb and Joshua said, you know, we can do this. We can ascend to the land. We can defeat the people there, and let's try it. And this is the fallout, that those 10 and maybe others associated with them are plagued. So that's sort of a bit of a leadership challenge. Now we then see, on the heels of another leadership challenge to Moses, where Korach and 250 leaders directly challenge his leadership along with Aaron, and they all die. Next day, the whole Israelite community railed against Moses and Aaron, saying, you two have brought death upon the Lord's people. But as the community gathered against them, Moses and Aaron turned toward the tent of meeting. And cloud had covered it, and the presence of the Lord appeared. When Moses and Aaron reached the tent of meeting, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, remove yourselves from this community, that I may annihilate them in an instant. They fell on their faces. Then Moses said to Aaron, take the fire pan, put it on it fire from the altar, and add incense, and take it quickly to the community and make expiation for them. For wrath has gone forth from the Lord. The plague has begun. Aaron took it as Moses had ordered and ran to the midst of the congregation where the plague had begun among the people. He put on the incense and made expiation for the people. He stood between the dead and the living until the plague was checked. Those who died of the plague came to 14,700, aside from those who died on account of Korach. Aaron then returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting, since the plague was checked. Now, this is much more of a spreading plague than we experienced before. That seemed to be just those 10 men who provided that evil report. Here is it's been a breakout. There was an outbreak of some sort of plague here that killed 14,700. And also, really quite curiously, it says, aside from those who died on account of Korach. It's unclear if are those associated with Korach somehow died also of a plague. It's a little bit unclear from the phrasing here, but let's just stick with this number of 14,700. Clearly, thousands and thousands of people died of this plague, and what they needed was this incense to somehow make expiation for the people and to stop the plague. They got in between the plague people and the non-plague people. Maybe it was in the air, unclear. The next time we see a plague occurring is also a little bit of a challenge to Moses' leadership. And yes, this plague is in our Torah portion. It's towards the end. So Moses said to Israel's officials, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. Just then, a certain Israelite man came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions, in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite man into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite man and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. So that means in this week's Torah portion, we have the most deadly plague in all of the Torah. That's 24,000 people. That is a lot of people to die by plague. Way more even than the 14,700 as we saw previously, way more than the 10 for the first appearance of a plague. We also later on have, and this actually appears in next week's Torah portion, but it is a bit of a follow-up from what we see at the end of this week's Torah portion. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, assail the Midianites and defeat them, for they assailed you by the trickery they practiced against you, because of the affair of Peor and because of the affair of their kinswoman Cosbi, daughter of the Midianite chieftain, who was killed at the time of the plague on account of Peor. And the plague was over. And later on, one other mention is, yet they are the very ones who are at the bidding of Bilam, induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the Lord's community was struck by the plague. So we really have, although we have a multiplicity of mentions of plagues, Magefa, in the book of Numbers, we really just have three particular incidents of plague. The first being those 10 leaders of the various tribes who went to Israel, checked it out, but said, we can't conquer the people there. And they were killed. They died by plague. We had the 14,700 people who died by plague. Unclear what the cause of that was, but that was coming off of the heels of the Korach rebellion. And the third and final one is in this week's Torah portion, with 24,000 people dying of plague. Pretty bad, but it's actually interesting how each of these three plagues comes to a conclusion. In the very first one, there is no specific ending. It just seems that it only affected these 10 men, and that's it. In the previous one, where we see Aaron stepping up and offering incense, and that takes care of expiation, and that checks the plague, that stops it in its tracks. And then when we get to this week's Torah portion, the stopping is when Pinchas, it's interesting because Aharon was a Kohen, Aaron, and Pinchas is also, he becomes a Kohen, and that he shish kebabs these two people, and that somehow stops the plague in its tracks. I will say it's hard to not mention some rabbinic commentaries, some insights on these different plagues, and I wanted to share them with you to provide a little bit more of what we can see from these. So we have, and this goes back, it's interesting because the rabbis, certainly in the Talmud and elsewhere, are a lot more fixated when we talk about these three plagues, are a lot more fascinating about the 10 men who died and that plague rather than these latter two plagues. I just want to share these with you. So we have this Talmudic sort of exploration of what happened. How did these 10 men die? So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, he lived in the third century of the Common Era. This means that they died shemetu mita mishuna. It's sort of an unusual death. Rabbi Hanina bar Papa says that Rabbi Shila ish kfar tamartatat, this teaches that their tongues were stretched upon their navels, and worms were crawling out of their tongues and entering their navels, and worms were coming out of the navels and entering their tongues. Something really super duper awful. Now and then Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said they died of diphtheria, which causes them to choke to death. Now, I think what's going on, especially this weird one about worms and tongues, and it sounds really strange, but I think the point that they're trying to make, and I think even for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, is that their deaths, the plague that killed them, came about because of what they did, which is to offer with their mouths, with their speech, evil speech, and they died by that way. And here, it's basically, actually, we're going to see this You know what? We're going to see this explicated. I'm not going to explain it now. We're going to see this explicated by a medieval commentator. So we get Ibn Ezra, who he's a medieval commentator, says altogether. Okay, so Ibn Ezra, for these 10 by the plague, this just means they kulam yachad. It all happened at once, that it wasn't one after another. They just all simultaneously died. Now, Rashi, what is this plague? He says, by that death which was fitting for them, measure for measure. They had sinned with their tongue, therefore the tongue grew long, extending right down to their navels, and worms came from their tongue and entered their navels. So now he's picking up on that earlier midrash we saw in the Talmud. This is the reason why it states they died by the plague and not a plague. This too is the meaning of the words before the Lord. By that plague which was fitting for them according to the methods of the Holy One, blessed be he who metes out measure for measure. Okay, that actually is kind of poetic, very logical, and also it seems that it did not extend to other people. And finally, we have another medieval commentator, Sforno, who says, from the type of pestilence which they claimed had caused the death of the people they had seen dying in the land of Canaan during their tour of exploration, it was the kind of pollution in the air which kills almost instantly, which is weird. Why those 10, but not Caleb and not Yehoshua? That's a little strange, but still interesting. Now, amongst these, I didn't share anything about the latter two plagues, but certainly, look, I think what caught my eye, I wanted to talk about plagues because, of course, we see it at the end of this week's Torah portion, but can't help but think about, that's right, COVID. Obviously, COVID is somewhat of a plague, and we do what we can to try to stop it. And it's also interesting that we see in the first of these three plagues, it's the 10 men, and the rabbis have what to say about that. When it comes to these latter two instances of plagues in the book of Numbers, we do see specific actions taking place, people specifically taking action into their own hands to stop and to check the plague. In the first, in that second instance, it's Aaron taking these incense plates to offer expiation to stop it. Somehow it seems as if it's in the air, and somehow the incense is able to stop that. And here it's unclear exactly how Pinchas, by taking the spear and killing these two people, stops it, but maybe somehow the Midianites were bringing in some sort of infection to the Israelites and causing them to die. It's unclear, but 24,000 people is a lot. So I will also say one other thing. It is rather fascinating that it's not as if in each of these narratives, it's not as if there's an introduction, there's this plague, it's been going on, and people are wondering what can we do? We don't see any problem solving going on. We don't see what people are experiencing. We don't read of what people are experiencing throughout this plague. We really just see that in the first instance with the 10 leaders, they died by plague. We don't know what their experience was. In the second instance, we kind of hear that something's going on. And so Aaron runs, grabs a pan, offers up incense, and is able to check the plague. And in the third one, we don't even know that a plague is going on until after Pinchas has committed his action, and we're told that it's been stopped. I find it really fascinating that in these narratives about plagues, we don't really see we don't read about any of the experiences of people going through it or how people were trying to figure out how to stop it. We just read of the successful actions that are committed to end them. So hopefully this was, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about these three instances of plagues here in the book of Numbers. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for watching. And before we go, I just want to acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Majestic Care of Cedar Village are through the financial support of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. Thank you. All right, with that, I want to say thank you again and Shabbat Shalom.